Thank you, Valeria. Yeah, I mean, some of you might know my work. I work a long time now, maybe boringly, on consensual SM. I call it bodily practices. Maybe that's important to underline for me. Consensual SM is never just about so-called sexual practice, but it involves entire bodies, relationships. So it's not reducible to the so-called sexual realm. Why I also see it as a potential practice of resistance, because it allows a new meaning giving to our body parts, to relationships. It is far more a contextual way of understanding oneself and the relationship one has. It also allows us to, there's a profound need to communicate, which is very different to maybe normal relationships where there are certain assumptions about so-called sexuality and how it will operate. And of course, since I started the work, I've been always trying to decriminalize practitioners of consensual SM, which I think are wrongly in a situation of potential criminalization. Bizarrely, but I predicted that or saw that already coming in 2001. Capitalism, of course, commodified and proliferates so-called kinky sex. And I think it's a very problematic normalizing strategy. And especially what got me very angry was 50 Shades of Grey. Yeah, I'm not against that book or the film. Enjoy it or don't. But I find it really problematic when I think about how many people engage in reading this stuff and maybe think that they are doing something that is progressive or some kind of interesting exploration. Because for me, at least, the politics of truth in the so-called sexual realm, the order of things in the sexual realm, they bloody remain the same. It's very heteronormative. It ends up always also with penetrative sex, although there's, of course, a lot of other stuff going on, which I think is a good thing. But it's very much heteronormative. The relationship is anything, in my opinion at least, then consensual. And so for me, it really clashes that on the one hand side, there is a fetishization of 50 Shades and the toys, etc. But there's still people that engage in diverse bodily practices that really have to be careful in not revealing what they do. They have a lot of problems if it's, for example, about child custody cases, etc. I come to more details here. So that, of course, annoys me deeply. Sorry, I need to do my wonderful overheads. As you see, they are not PowerPoint, which I never ever use. The basis of my understanding of so-called sexuality is, of course, an interactionist one, a social constructionist one, which contrasts with mainstream, but also with legal understandings that are the basis for the semi-criminalization of consensual SM. I'm using here a quote by Jeffrey Weeks, who stated, and I think he puts it in a nice nutshell, sexuality is something which society produces in complex ways. It is the result of diverse social practices that give meaning to human activities, of social definitions and self-definitions, of struggles between those who have the power to define and regulate and those who resist. So far more complex, far more open, far more fluid an understanding of what sexuality is or might be. And of course, it involves also the possibility of change, something that is not fixed, like in positivist understandings of so-called sexuality. In the normative realm of the law, however, so-called sexuality continues to hold a crudely modern position as a special part of life and of the body, as even the appeal judges in the House of Lords during the Spanner case, and I quote, decided that it was not possible to consent to an assault that led to injuries that were more than trifling or transient, if sexual pleasure was the aim. However, there were exceptions, such as injuries resulting from medical practice, as well as consenting to being injured in sports, such as boxing and rugby, entertainment, such as knife throwing, and cosmetic procedures, of course, think of all the money that would otherwise not be spent, and also, of course, tattooing and piercing. So, of course, this essentialist construction of sexuality, as well as sexual deviance and so-called sexual pathology, also inform mainstream media representations of, and I want to put this very much into inverted commas, consensual SM. As I said, for example, in 50 Shades of Grey, I would really not see that as a very consensual relationship at all, although there is always the talk of some kind of contract. But it's very much, we have traditional problematic power relationship of heteronormative expectations between very wealthy men and a woman that is in a way very lacking confidence, lacking power, very much positioned as a female. So the problem is, of course, we are engaging when we are internalizing these media representations in the categorization of people and populations on the basis of their so-called ascribed sexuality. And this is one form in which power works, which, of course, Foucault calls biopower. And this, sadly, continues to work in contemporary times, despite all this proliferation of kinky sex. So to me, sorry, I need to do this again. Yeah, oops, yeah, I mean, this has, of course, to come. I ask, what is the good? Because in a way, I'm, of course, happy that people talk about other ways of engaging with relationships or engaging with toys, trying other stuff out. So we could say maybe this is the good. Maybe that is a good thing out of this kinky sex proliferation and commodification. However, the problem I see with that is, first of all, it's decontextualized. It never talks about how do we negotiate. It doesn't ever tell us anything about wrong expectations that we might have internalized, like when a man meets a woman, it has to happen, no? Or when two women, do they have a certain expectation, what will happen, what will not happen, no? And of course, consensual SM allows us to communicate, negotiate, and sets that basically as a premise for any action. I wanted to just quote, because I just don't want to talk about practitioners without including them. Because as you see, the commodification of kinky sex is a big market, which I will, of course, then talk about in the ugly part of my presentation. But I want to just briefly let Betty, one of my interviewees who was very forthcoming with telling me lots about her life. And she says, for example, that dressing up and toys are not that important if you play consensual SM. She said, I've always done it without. I only dress up when I have to, when I go to a club, interestingly enough. I think I actually feel quite strongly about it from my own point of view. I think if you can't do something like dominate somebody without sort of dressing up in high heel boots and things, then in a way you're not that dominant anyhow. You don't know how to play. So this idea that we just buy some fucking toys and then just we go out and do it is, of course, bloody dangerous. And then typically, and I think Featherstone puts this very well, commodities hence become free to take on a wide range of cultural associations and illusions. And I think that is a very dangerous illusion, that I buy some handcuffs and a whip and then I'm ready to do consensual SM. Advertising in particular is able to exploit this and attach images of romance, erotica, desire, beauty, fulfillment, communality, scientific progress, and the good life to mundane consumer goods such as soap, washing machines, motor cars, and alcoholic drinks, which might be actually less dangerous to play with. But wait. I want to just quote some numbers here. The film adaptation of 50 Shades of Grey shook things up at the Pornhub. Specifically, people are getting freakier, yeah, this, I quote this, of course, of Pornhub, yeah, in their pornographic preferences. And we've got the data to prove it. Apparently, searches involving the word chains were up 20%, and uses of the term dominate were up 40%, and 55% more people were looking for submission. So clearly there is an interest triggered by the proliferation of kinky sex without the additional information that would be necessary. So a good consequence of the commodification of kink in the form of the 50 Shades brand could be seen in the facilitation of conversations and explorations around different, if commodified and stripped of their appropriate context, bodily practices, and potentially different relationships between bodies. Coco de Mer's managing director Lucy Litwack, for example, stated, first-time 50 Shades shoppers are actually a surprising confident bunch. We have found that people who are trying our products for the first time are feeling more confident and heading immediately to what we would consider more niche products, rather than wanting to stay on safer ground until they feel more comfortable. To me, that just makes me freak out, really, to be honest. Now, of course, I'm also quite angry because I got to know a very nice group of people and community when I did my research. So for me, it's a total exploitation of a really important culture and a possibility of relating, of experiencing life. And I think Shanice Mahil, I hope I pronounced that proper, shows us the dangers of potential cultural appropriation, because she says it doesn't have to be a harmful thing, but the immense difficulty arises in pinpointing when appropriation is respectful, and I would say it's absolutely disrespectful, that appropriation, and appreciative, and when it's exploitative. Now, because I know I don't have that much time, I go now to the bad before I do the ugly. Yeah. So, what is so problematic about the mainstream depiction of SM? The real problematic is, of course, that in all these mainstream appropriations and exploitations of SM, I don't want to even say consensual, I find that difficult in this context. There is not a challenge to normative sexuality and relationships. Most of these mainstream representations are very heteronormative. They have inbuilt power relationships, and worst of all, for me at least, is that it always is an inkling of pathology there. There's SM play, but in the end we will hear that there was some traumatic event in the life of, in this case, Christian Grey, or in the film The Secretary, a female person. Something awful happened at the beginning of their life, and therefore that's the only way they can get off. And then they have a healing heterosexual romantic relationship that will bring them back to normative heterosexuality, which is penetrative, and best, of course, in 50 Shades, it leads to a child. I love children, but you can do other stuff as well. No? It doesn't have to come to that. Yeah. So what I think is absolutely problematic is, of course, that normative relationships and sexuality are not challenged here. I like Scott in that way here. A common quality of pop culture characters who participate in BDSM, and the frustratingly common assumption about real-life BDSM participants, is that they must be mentally damaged in some way. BDSM is still, whether explicitly stated or quietly believed, regularly assumed to be sick, freaky, deviant, wrong. Much like the dominant view of homosexuality until recently, and before then, interracial relationships. The deliberate seeking of pain, humiliation, and extreme sensation is pathologized and presumed to be the result of past trauma or mental illness. despite the fact that no one has ever been included in the DSMS for playing rugby or appearing on the X Factor. I think that is a lovely quote. So I think that illustrates maybe my concern quite a lot. And of course, I want to go to the ugly now, because I fucking hate capitalism. Sorry. You have time, or you can, of course, have questions. While, of course, we can say the main problems might be that the sexual order of things is remained, but there's a lot of money being made here. And so what concerns me is also the capitalist appropriation, pushing stereotypes. The lazy and predictable association drawn between kinkiness and past abuse or mental illness in the relatively few contemporary fictional depictions of SM relationships out there is arguably far more harmful for SM's image than the classification in the DSM. Lee Holloway in the popular Soft King film Secretary is a sexually masochistic, recovering self-harmer who has just been released from a psychiatric unit. Christian Grey is in the nausea-eating, ubiquitous 50 Shades of Grey, suffered abuse as a child, revealed when he projects his hatred of his mother onto Anna. He also violates the principles of risk-aware consensual kink on numerous occasions. But one mustn't let the dullness of positive, realistic depictions of SM and its practitioners get in the way of a scandalous story, because it makes more money, of course. So I wanted to just look at some money again. Where do I have the money? It has sold 100 million copies, I think, that book. So you can imagine how much money that can have made. But what are the harms as well? And here I'm quoting nothing. There have been at least 4 prosecutions of SM practitioners in the UK since 1990, including the Spanner case, when 5 men were jailed for giving each other consensual beatings, lacerations, and genital aberrations for sexual pleasure. It led to the establishment of the Spanner Trust, which seeks to defend the rights of SM practitioners, and changed the UK court ruling that made consensual SM activities illegal. Outed kinky people are often extremely disadvantaged in child custody cases, and kinky people entering therapy regularly face stigma because of their sexuality. According to the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom's 2013 survey, and that is already a year after 50 Shades. So you see, it continues. While we make money, we still continue to criminalize and pathologize people. 82% of kinky people feel that society doesn't accept them. So we buy the shit, but we don't accept people who practice it. The effects of societal stigma are startling. Brame's survey of almost 7,000 kinky people, although scientifically sketchy, especially when its rather limited questioning criteria are taken into account, found that 23% of them have definitely felt guilty or ashamed about their sexual desires. 4% have considered suicide. 14 are not out to anyone, including lovers or close friends. She also noted that 20% of respondents had at some point tried to give up their SM fetish interest to be more normal, although it is difficult to tell whether social stigma was an underlying factor in all cases. According to Pendle, in 2006, it is more difficult for consensual SM players to win custody cases as well as to refute allegations of assault following a consensual scene. There is a need for the UK law to be changed, and European law as well, of course, in order to legally protect consensual players when injury occurs. However, of course, corporate kink, is ongoing. In a critical exploration of the internet and the commodification of kink, Michael Thompson in 2014 stated, after 20 years of living with the mass internet, sexual experimentation has become a specialist racket, a place one visits if one can afford the gear. Like a scuba diving vacation in the Caribbean. The times have made us bizarrely conservative as a precondition to selling us back normalcy, as if it were an exotic good. Kink.com is amongst the biggest industrial authorities on sexual deviance. The internet worked best not when it sought to replace old forms of media, but when it became a garish bazaar of everything old media had no room for. It was an industrial phenomenon to extract mass market value for everything that had not yet been commodified into a profit-driven symbol of its former self. If there was a way of finding a General Motors of paraphilia, it would have to run through the internet. Yeah, so you can see, of course, it is the biggest market possible. And I want to also maybe make a plea for people who work in the industry of kinky pornography, because there is a danger. If there's so much money to be made, so much more movies will be made, and more pressure is being put onto the performers. In the documentary Kink by Christiana Voros, she points to the problem that kink space of production remains so high, it guarantees none of the bureaucratic structures necessary to practicing the ideals of sane and consensual that they claimed to be doing, yeah? Because these ideals are not economically viable. Longer periods between casting and filming would be needed, because you can imagine the bodies are exhausted. Extended rehearsal and planning periods, shots spread across multiple days to mitigate the pressures of wanting to soldier through, to keep the crew and the director happy. Resources for counseling both before and after the shot to ensure each performer's personal history is honored and protected throughout the shoot. So you can see all of that is, of course, putting a lot of danger, not just to people who play around not knowing what consent really means, what negotiation implies, that it's important to have a safety word or a safety gesture, that it's important to do aftercare. Yeah, all of that doesn't, of course, show in mainstream representations. So I want to just try to look at my conclusion now, so you can, if you want, have some questions. Sorry, I have to go. Of course, one little, this is a work in progress. I'm really sick of the class representation in 50 Shades, made me fucking sick. How this woman always admires how he dresses and how much steel is in the building and how much money he has. So it's basically also, how can we say, a fetishization of commodities, a fetishization of capitalism. So it's a really problematic piece of shit. Yeah, so you can see fetish shots of what money can provide. That's what I would say is very much a through-going theme in this awful series of books and the film. Yeah, I have done this, sorry. I'm running through my... Here, kink corporate safety, no? I mean, the word corporate in the kink.con. Wait, I'm now here. Yeah. So neoliberalism shifts state functions, we know not exclusively, but many of them, to the private sector, and additionally operates as a mode of governmentality that shifts strategy of government to private individuals. The model neoliberal citizen therefore calculates his and or her choices within multiple conditions of domination without ever attempting to alter these spheres. That's another additional problem I have with the representation, because consensual SM tries to open spaces to make relationships flexible, and that doesn't ever happen in the mainstream representation. So yeah. Traditions of heteronormativity are therefore upheld within much of mainstream representations. For example, the main actors return to normal heterosexual lives forever after. The lives of sexually diverse are reprivatized and domesticated in relation to the commodification of SM. Perhaps with the hope to depoliticize queer, non-conforming bodies and their bodily practices. Similar processes can be observed in the aftermath of the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act in 2013 in relation to gay and lesbian bodies. So, yeah, I think my role as an academic is to help change the situation and to problematize the commodification and not let people think that they are suddenly progressive when they're basically buying into the same old shit but have some nice shiny toys with it. Yeah.
I think we have something like 15 minutes for questions, comments.
So was I good on time then?
Yeah.
Normally I'm not. Yeah, I'm here and I'm just taking the stick out. Any questions? No?
Yes.
You actually pointed it out that the issue of injuries, I think it's particularly well, a big issue. How do you deal with it? Where is the limit? Or how in sexual acts? Sometimes the case that came to my mind was Amanda Fox, the American student in Italy. So I don't know the full story of it and whether it was whatever, but and whether it was the same case or something else. But yeah, I think it's that.
So do you want me to answer that for commodified kink or for consensual SM practitioners?
Yes, and from legal aspects and how it differs.
Yeah, well, the legal aspects, I think I stated quite clearly, as long as you produce wounds that are more than transient and trifling, however that might be defined, you might get criminalized and prosecuted, which I think is problematic. Consensual SM practitioners learn, it is like a socialization, education process when you enter the scene, where people, first of all, don't presume you want to do certain things, but you observe, yeah? You learn what possibilities might be there. People show you how to use toys, how to clean them, how to use them safely. They teach you also, and that is something people might think, oh, that's self-understood, but to negotiate and communicate very intimately, openly. I don't think that was the case with Amanda Fox, yeah? No. Yeah, in a way, it's like a school education, yeah? How to use your body in a different way. Not to think everything has to be genitally fixed, no? Like in traditional relationships in the normative realm. So you learn to have a different relationship to your own body, but also, of course, to others. You don't have expectations. You don't think, oh, because yesterday I did this, I can do it today as well. Or because I meet a woman or a man, this is what they will have to do. Do you see what I mean? And then you have the safety word, you have safety gestures if you're being gagged, yeah, or in a body bag, you can, of course, not shout much. No? So you have to do some gesture, some movement, yeah. And then also, even if people don't do the movement or don't do the gesture, a good talk, a good dominant will check in on the person, yeah. So that no injury, yeah, occurs that is not, well, let's say unavoidable because people enjoy it, yeah. I know my oldest interviewee was over 80, and he liked to be whipped since he was quite a younger person. Yeah, he had a long tradition of liking to be whipped. And he liked, of course, the sensation also on his body, but he knew that given that his body was older and also the skin was a bit taking, sorry, yeah, he could not take as much as he might have enjoyed. So he said, I can only do it twice a month. Yeah, so do you see there was something like not an excess. I think excess is the realm of so-called romantic Nicholas Luhmann. He analyzes romantic relationships and the inherent violence in that, and he says it's immoderateness and excessiveness which is the aim there, no? That you long so much it tears you apart. And I think consensual SM might for some people seem boring because it's trying to find a balance, a moderateness, yeah, not going like boom boom and then having all these injuries. So I hope that made some sense.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
thanks. No, that's absolutely fantastic, and I thought what came through as well, and I know it's kind of fairly well established, was the way in which S&M challenges those boundaries between safety and danger, and how that in fact articulates itself through the legal ruling, particularly Brown and Spanner, because what was exceptional about sexuality is distinct from some of the other activities. But what I really wanted to ask was, could you tell us a bit more about what your respondents were saying with respect to perhaps the legal situation and perhaps around safety and danger, as they might have experienced it both, say, subjectively in terms of their own practices, but also the way in which it played out and the way in which legal prescriptions or social prescriptions were also the bigger context for their practice. Yeah.
Well, a lot of practitioners would be less visible. Yeah, I mean, I remember when I first went into the field, people said, "Oh, I just do soft stuff." And the longer I was familiar and gained trust, the more I saw there's quite a lot of hardcore SM going on. So it's a lack of visibility, and I really enjoyed observing workshops. By a lot of workshops now are not allowing you to take notes anymore. I mean, filming would be totally excluded because people are fearful that they can be criminalized, and that has a profound bad impact on this education process, because if I cannot really go into detail how to prevent potential harm, how can I teach other people So that is, I think, a really problematic aspect. And some people might also, like I quoted there, stop doing it. And I think I'm not promoting everybody, come on, be SM, do it or not. No, that's not my problem. But it's bad if people feel inhibited to explore their own sensuality. For me, it's about sensuality and intimacy predominantly. It doesn't even sometimes have to involve the body. Some people just do it in their mental space. I don't know if that answered anything. I hope.
One in back.
Andrea, I just really wanted to sort of pick up on, I think one of the things, in the sense that 50 Shades has kind of been a distraction, because I think even if you go back before 50 Shades, there are ambiguities and difficulties.
Of course, yeah. I'm just taking this as one case.
Community, and particularly, to me, what the critical issue is always consent. And I just found that the sort of typography of consensual SM and the rest kind of misses where it's really interesting, because consent is not unproblematic. We all bring all sorts of inequalities, all sorts of privileges.
Of course.
And you're also talking about an arena which is really opened to to abuse.
Of course.
Because at one level, one of the things which the BDSM community sometimes present is this get-out clause. When things go horribly wrong, well, that wasn't consensual, that was nothing to do with us. And actually, I find that's escaping responsibility. And there is a, I think, I don't want to use the word grey, I'm trying to find another word, grey. There is quite a grey area.
I like it.
It's a continuum rather than a, hey, this is consensual and hey, that's not.
Yeah, I mean, in my book, I say also, I'm not saying this is an ideal community. But I think in contrast to normative expectations, normative ways of relating with each other, it is a possibility to have better relationships. And apart from the education and the socialization to learn negotiation and aiming for consent, in the clubs and in the play parties, there's informal mechanisms of control. And usually when people do break consent, these people are not played with anymore. Yeah, so in a way it's like a self-policing thing. And I agree with you, there is space for abuse, but when I think of domestic abuse and rape, that's ongoing. And there's not much happening about trying to delimit that. So I think, for me, my ideal thing would be to teach consensual SM at school. To teach people to communicate from when they are very young and not to assume that they want to have penetrative sex. Because maybe people don't. No, there is lots of people who don't feel that they want to do that. Why should they have the pressure and the expectation that they need to do that? Do you see? So if people would learn to know how to speak about their body from a young age and the relationship to other bodies and what could be pleasurable, and that things don't need to stay the same. That's another issue I have with this positivist idea. We have a certain sexual identity and that will remain. Because in the scene I saw people transitioning through different things. I don't know if that makes sense. I think it's better if we have the tools of consensual SM. Abuse can happen anywhere. But I think the people, how they learn to negotiate and communicate, have a bigger chance of not abusing it, and with the informal control mechanisms, than what mainstream society is doing. Do you see? I see there is, of course, zones in between, gray zones. But I think the danger for me is more in mainstream society thinking we are right, and we're not. I hope that made some sense.
Yeah, just very briefly, because we have like 4 or 5 minutes, no more.
Okay, it doesn't necessarily need to answer my question. We'll talk about it afterwards. But I'm just interested with 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, why that book? Right? There's always been erotic fiction that largely poorly represents bodily practices in all sorts of arenas. Why that book? I feel like Simon Cowell was behind it or something, promoting it. Or, do you know what I mean? It sort of came out of the blue. Those things have always been there. I'm just interested about if you've got any thoughts about the timing of it. Was there a political agenda behind that? Was something else going on in the real world, and this was a way of deliberately poorly representing something? Or I think conspiracies, but I'm just...
Sex has sold out, do you know? I think in 2001 I wrote something about, we have basically commodified normal sex, whatever that might be, to death. Yeah, it doesn't sell much, it isn't spicy enough. So therefore, I think, in a way, 50 Shades of Grey, at its core, reminds me, I never read this stuff, but when I was young, there were some people who read, the nurse meets the doctor. And the doctor is a bit aloof emotionally. And then the nurse suddenly manages to get to his heart. And then they, live forever after. And this kind of bollocks is then spiced up a bit with kink. So, just to make it sell better, because sex is sold out. No, it doesn't arouse anyone anymore, well, very little maybe, comparatively. I'm pushing it a bit, I know.
Brief question. Did you study the notion of safer sex within the community?
Mm-hmm.
What is the attitude, or what kind of attitudes are there?
Well, a lot of practitioners would say safe and sane and consensual is their motto. Yeah, safe, sane and consensual is for many SM practitioners their guideline. But then there's some, not a minority, but there are some practitioners who would say, I like to explore also edge play. Yeah, so they try to maybe not always keep to certain limits, but only in very long-term relationships where they think they can, but they are usually not regarded very well in the main core of sane, safe and consensual. Yeah, that is the, I would say, mainstream SM culture. I don't know if that makes
to
sense.
so-called leather men.
Leathermen, well, I know there's also leathermen who don't do safe sex, barebacking, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But I specifically study SM culture, not necessarily gay men barebacking. Yeah, I know that culture exists as well, and I understand that it's about the thrill of playing with death. Yeah, there's a lot of playing with death, the boundary between life and death. So I find that interesting theoretically, but I wouldn't see that as a safe practice, of course.
No.
I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes.
Good.
So I think we can move to the second.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.